November 1881. The Wind River Range, Wyoming Territory. When the first snow fell that year, it came early and heavy. By mid-October, homesteaders along the Popo-Agie River were already splitting wood at a frantic pace, racing against the calendar. Everyone knew the rule. You needed 4 cords minimum to survive a Wyoming winter. Maybe 5 if the season turned mean. But there was a problem nobody talked about much in town. A problem that killed fires, wasted effort, and left families shivering in the dark even when they had wood stacked to the rafters. Wet firewood. You could split until your hands bled. You could stack it neat and tight under every overhang you had. But when November rain turned to sleet, when snow piled 3 feet high and then melted during a Chinook wind, when February brought that wet, heavy snow that soaked through tarps and canvas like they weren't even there, you had got wet. And wetwood doesn't burn. It smokes. It hisses. It robs heat instead of giving it. Most men just accepted it. That's winter. That's the mountains. You split more. You burn more. You suffer through it. One man didn't accept it. His name was Everett Ashford, and in the fall of 1881, he dug a hole beneath his house that made the whole valley think he'd lost his mind. Before we go further, if you're watching this, do me a favor. Hit that like button and subscribe, because every week on this channel, I bring you real survival techniques from the American frontier. Techniques that actually worked when comfort wasn't optional, it was survival. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I want to know if you're dealing with wet firewood right now, or if you've got your own tricks for keeping it dry. Now let's talk about what Everett built, and why nobody believed it would work. Everett Ashford wasn't a genius. He wasn't an engineer. He was a carpenter from Pennsylvania who'd come west in '78 with his wife Margaret and their 2 young boys. He built a solid cabin on a rise above the river. Good foundation, tight chinking, stone fireplace. By frontier standards, it was a respectable home. But Everett had a problem that gnawed at him every winter. His firewood storage was a mess. Like everyone else, he stacked his wood on the north side of the cabin under a sloped lean-to roof. Tarps over the top, rocks holding them down. It worked fine in dry cold. But Wyoming doesn't give you dry cold. It gives you freeze-thaw cycles. It gives you rain that turns to ice. It gives you snow that melts in the afternoon sun and refreezes at night, locking your woodpile into a single frozen, soggy mass. Everett spent half his winter mornings prying apart frozen logs with a splitting maul, trying to find pieces dry enough to catch. Even when he got a fire going, the wet wood would choke it out with steam and creosote. His chimney clogged. His family breathed smoke. And the math was brutal. Wetwood burns at maybe 60% efficiency compared to dry. That meant he was burning almost twice as much to get the same heat. In the summer of 1881, Everett made a decision that baffled his neighbors. He was going to dig a root cellar, not for vegetables, but for firewood. Not beside the house, not behind it, beneath it. He planned to excavate a chamber directly under the main room of his cabin, accessible by a trapdoor in the kitchen floor, with a secondary external entrance on the downhill side for loading wood. The underground space would stay dry, stable, and protected from weather. Gravity would drain any moisture away from the house. The earth itself would insulate the wood from freeze-thaw cycles. To Everett, it made perfect sense. To everyone else, it sounded insane. "You're going to dig under your own foundation?" his neighbor Jacob Pruitt asked, standing in Everett's yard that July, watching him mark out the dimensions with stakes and string. "Not under the foundation," Everett said. "Offset by 2 feet. The walls of the cellar won't touch the house supports." Jacob shook his head. "You're asking for a collapse, or flood, or both." Margaret Ashford didn't say much, but Everett could see the worry in her eyes. Still, she trusted him. He'd built the cabin right the first time. He'd fixed the chimney when it cracked. He knew his way around stone and timber. By late August, Everett was waist-deep in the earth beneath his home, hauling out buckets of clay and rock, shoring up walls with split logs, and laying a gravel bed at the bottom for drainage. The chamber measured roughly 8 feet wide, 12 feet long, and 6 feet high at the center. Enough room for 3 cords of split wood, stacked neat and accessible. The whole valley heard about it, and the whole valley thought Everett Ashford had gone mad. Let's talk about what Everett actually built, because the engineering here is smarter than it looks. The underground wood shelter wasn't just a hole. It was a carefully designed thermal and hydrological system that took advantage of three key principles: stable subsurface temperature, gravity drainage, and vapor pressure equilibrium. First, the excavation. Everett dug down roughly 5 feet below the cabin floor, which put the base of the chamber about 7 feet below ground level on the uphill side. He chose a spot where the natural grade sloped away from the house, ensuring that any water entering the system would flow downhill and away from the structure. The floor of the chamber wasn't dirt. It was a 6-inch bed of coarse gravel, laid over compacted clay. This created a French drain effect. Water could percolate down through the gravel and move laterally toward the external entrance, where it drained into a shallow ditch that led away from the homestead. No standing water, no mud, no moisture creeping back up into the woodpile. The walls were a combination of dry-stacked fieldstone on the lower half and split logs on the upper half, all of it packed with clay and small stones for stability. Everett left deliberate gaps between the upper logs. Ventilation ports no wider than 2 inches, positioned on opposite walls to allow air circulation without letting in rain or snow. Now here's the critical part: the chamber's connection to the house. Everett cut a trapdoor in the kitchen floor, roughly 3 feet square, directly above the wood storage. He framed it with double joists and added a hinged lid lined with wool scraps for insulation. When closed, it was nearly airtight. When open, you could lower a ladder and climb down to grab an armload of wood without ever stepping outside. But he didn't stop there. On the downhill side of the chamber, he dug a sloped tunnel, 4 feet high, just wide enough for a man to crouch walk through, that emerged outside the house about 15 feet away. This was the loading entrance. In autumn, Everett could split wood in the yard, carry it through the tunnel, and stack it underground without tracking mud or snow through his kitchen. A low wooden door at the tunnel mouth kept animals out and held back drifting snow. The system was elegant in its simplicity. Underground, the temperature stays remarkably stable. Even in deep winter, soil below the frost line hovers between 45 and 55 degrees Fahrenheit. That's cold enough to prevent rot and mold, but warm enough to keep wood from freezing into a solid block. More importantly, the humidity underground remains low once you establish proper drainage and airflow. Wet firewood doesn't just get wet from rain. It absorbs moisture from the air. That's why wood stored in damp basements or covered outdoor piles still ends up soggy. But in Everett's chamber, the gravel floor drained liquid water away, while the ventilation ports allowed water vapor to escape. The earth walls absorbed ambient humidity. The result was a microclimate perfectly suited to keeping split wood dry, even when the surface world was drowning in snowmelt. Everett finished the chamber in early September 1881. He spent the rest of the month splitting and stacking. By the time the first hard frost in October, he had 2.5 cords underground, accessible day or night without stepping into the weather. His neighbors watched. They shook their heads, and they waited for the whole thing to fail. Daniel Calhoun was the man people listened to when it came to building in the Wind River Valley. He'd been there since '74, had built half the cabins along the Popo Aggie, and he knew stone and timber the way some men know scripture. In late September, Calhoun stopped by Everett's place to see the underground shelter for himself. He stood at the edge of the external tunnel entrance, arms crossed, jaw tight, and didn't say a word for a full minute. Finally, he spoke. "Ashford, I've seen men try clever things before. Most of them end badly." Everett wiped his hands on his trousers. "It's sound, Daniel. The drainage works. The walls are stable. For now," Calhoun said. "You wait until spring melt. All that snowpack sitting on top of your house is going to turn to water, and it's going to find the weakest point in the ground, which is going to be your hole. How about the gravel bed? Gravel bed won't matter when you've got 200 gallons an hour trying to move through frozen ground. It'll pool, it'll seep, and then your whole cellar's going to be a mud pit. You'll lose the wood, and if you're unlucky, you'll lose the house when the ground shifts." Everett kept his voice calm. "The slope carries it away. I've tested it." Calhoun's expression didn't change. "You tested it in summer. Not under 3 feet of snow, with frozen ground and melt happening faster than the soil can take it. Word spread fast. By October, the story of Everett's underground cellar had become a kind of running joke in the valley. Men at the trading post grinned when his name came up. Women shook their heads and said things like, "Poor Margaret, married to a man who digs holes under his own house." Jacob Pruitt was blunt about it. "You're going to flood your foundation, Everett. And when that happens, don't come asking to borrow my timber to rebuild." Even Margaret's sister, visiting from Lander, pulled her aside one evening and said, "Is he all right? I mean in the head?" Margaret didn't answer. She just watched Everett that night, sitting by the fire, sketching drainage angles in a notebook by candlelight, and she hoped he was right. The criticism wasn't just skepticism. It was rooted in real experience. These were men who'd seen homesteads fail for less. A cracked foundation could mean the difference between a house that lasted 20 years and one that sagged into ruin in 5. Water was the enemy of every structure on the frontier. And here was Everett, deliberately putting a void directly beneath his home, trusting that the ground wouldn't betray him. Daniel Calhoun said it best, standing outside the general store one cold afternoon in late October. Ashford's gamble isn't with his firewood. It's with his family's shelter. And that's not a gamble a smart man takes. Nobody argued. Winter was coming, and everyone would see who was right. The first snow of November 1881 was light. Powdery. It blew off the roof in gusts and didn't stick around long. Everett split a few more cords and stacked them through the tunnel entrance, filling the underground chamber nearly to the ceiling. By mid-November, he was done. 3 cords, bone dry, waiting in the dark beneath his kitchen. Then December hit. The temperature dropped fast. By the second week, morning lows were scraping 0 degrees Fahrenheit. The Popo Aggie froze at the edges, then clear across. Snow fell in waves, 8 inches one night, 12 the next, then a brief thaw that turned everything to slush before the cold locked it down again. This was the freeze-thaw cycle every homesteader dreaded. It started on December 18th. A warm Chinook wind blew down from the mountains, pushing temperatures up into the high 30s. Snow that had been dry and powdery turned wet and heavy. It stuck to everything. Roofs groaned under the weight. Tarps sagged, and every woodpile in the valley started absorbing water like a sponge. By nightfall, the wind shifted. Arctic air poured back in. Temperatures plunged to 15 below zero by morning. The wet snow froze solid. Jacob Pruitt's woodpile, stacked under a canvas lean-to on the north side of his cabin, became a single frozen mass. He spent an hour with a maul and a pry bar just to break loose enough logs for a morning fire. Half of them were too wet to catch. The other half burned with thick, choking smoke that sent his wife and children coughing onto the porch until the chimney cleared. Daniel Calhoun's would fared a little better. He'd covered his stacks with oiled canvas and weighted them with stones, but even his driest pieces were damp. He burned through a full cord in 3 weeks, twice his normal rate, because wetwood just doesn't produce heat the way drywood does. All across the valley, the same story played out. Fires that should have lasted 6 hours burned out in 3. Chimneys clogged with creosote. Men split wood in the freezing cold only to find the interior of the logs damp from months of exposure. Women boiled water on stoves that barely held a flame. Children slept in coats because the house never got warm enough. And then the real test came. On January 9th, 1882, a storm moved in that people still talked about 20 years later. It snowed for 4 straight days. 36 inches fell in the first 72 hours. Drifts piled 8 feet high against the north walls of cabins. The wind was relentless, ripping tarps off wood piles, scattering kindling, burying everything under a white, suffocating blanket. When the storm finally broke, the temperature dropped to 22 below zero. People burned furniture. They burned fence rails. They burned anything that would catch, because their firewood was either buried, frozen, or soaked through. Everett Ashford opened the trapdoor in his kitchen floor, climbed down the ladder, and pulled up an armload of split pine. It was dry as bone. The underground chamber had stayed at a steady 48 degrees Fahrenheit the entire time. No snow had entered. No moisture had pooled. The ventilation ports had allowed air to circulate without letting in precipitation. The gravel floor had drained away the trace condensation that formed when warm air met cold earth. Everett lit his fire with a single match. It caught immediately, burned clean, and held steady for 8 hours. Margaret stood at the stove, warming her hands, and didn't say a word. But she looked at her husband with something close to awe. Outside, the valley was suffering. Inside, the Ashford home was warm, and the neighbors were starting to notice. If you're still watching, stay with me, because what happened next didn't just prove Everett right. It changed the way people built homes in that valley for the next 50 years. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me, what's the coldest winter you've ever lived through? I'll see you in the next part. By late January 1882, the contrast was impossible to ignore. Jacob Pruitt had burned through 4.5 cords of wood in 2 months. Daniel Calhoun had gone through nearly 4. Most families in the valley were rationing their remaining supply, splitting green wood in desperation, trying to make it catch with kindling and pitch-soaked rags. Everett Ashford had burned 1.25 cords. Let that sink in for a moment. Same valley, same weather, same size homes, more or less. But Everett was using less than 1/3 of the wood his neighbors were consuming. The reason was simple: efficiency. When you burn wet wood, you're not just losing heat to the smoke. You're spending energy boiling off the moisture before the wood can even start to combust. A piece of firewood at 25% moisture content, which is what most outdoor stacked wood was sitting at after the December freeze-thaw cycles, requires roughly 1,100 BTUs per pound just to drive off the water. That's energy that should be warming your house, but instead it's disappearing up the chimney as steam. Everett's wood, stored underground at stable temperature and low humidity, averaged around 12% moisture content. That's nearly kiln dry. When he fed a log into his stove, it caught fast, burned hot, and produced almost no creosote. His chimney stayed clean. His fire radiated steady, even heat. He could load the stove at bedtime and wake up to coals still glowing red at dawn. His neighbors? They were waking up to cold ash and starting over every morning. But it wasn't just the fuel savings. It was the temperature inside the house. In early February, a traveling surveyor named William Hendricks stopped at both the Ashford and Pruitt cabins on the same afternoon. He carried a mercury thermometer, an expensive instrument at the time, used for weather observations, and he recorded the interior temperatures out of simple curiosity. Jacob Pruitt's cabin, with a fire burning strong in a stone fireplace, 58 degrees Fahrenheit. Everett Ashford's cabin, with a moderate fire in a similar fireplace, 68 degrees. 10 degrees warmer, with less wood. Hendricks mentioned the readings of the Trading Post a few days later, and the story spread like wildfire. 10 degrees doesn't sound like much until you're living in it. That's the difference between sleeping under 2 blankets or 4. Between frost forming on the inside of your windows or staying clear. Between your water bucket freezing overnight or staying liquid. And here's the other thing nobody had anticipated. Everett's wood supply was still growing. Because the underground chamber stayed dry and stable, Everett could continue splitting and storing wood throughout the winter. Most men couldn't do that. Their outdoor piles were frozen solid or buried under snow. But Everett could work on a mild day, split a half cord, and carry it through the tunnel into storage without worrying about it getting soaked in the next storm. By March, when his neighbors were scraping together the last of their stockpiles and eyeing their fence posts, Everett still had a cord and a half underground, dry and ready. Daniel Calhoun saw it with his own eyes. He'd stopped by in late February, ostensibly to borrow a saw, but really to see if the underground shelter had flooded during the spring melt. The temperature had climbed into the 40s for 3 straight days. Snow was melting everywhere, turning the ground into a soupy mess. Everett opened the trapdoor and invited Calhoun to look. The chamber was dry. The gravel floor had absorbed and drained away the minor seepage. The walls were solid, and the woodpile looked like it had been stacked yesterday. No mold, no rot, no moisture. Calhoun stood there, staring down into the chamber, and finally said the words Everett had been waiting months to hear. "I'll be damned." It wasn't an apology, but it was acknowledgement. The math didn't lie. Everett's system worked. and it worked better than anything else in the valley. Here's the breakdown, as best as local records and oral accounts can reconstruct. Average wood consumption per household, winter 1881 to 82. For 0.2 cords Everett Ashford's consumption. 1. 5 cords wood savings. 64% average interior temperature. February survey 56 to 60 degrees Fahrenheit Ashford interior temperature. 68 degrees Fahrenheit temperature advantage. 8 to 12 degrees Fahrenheit time spent retrieving firewood daily. Outdoor piles 15 to 25 minutes in harsh weather Ashford retrieval time. 2 minutes via indoor trapdoor convenience factor. Immeasurable, but significant. And then there was the spring melt test. The one Daniel Calhoun had warned would destroy everything. It didn't. The drainage system worked exactly as designed. Snowmelt percolated through the gravel bed, flowed downhill through the natural grade, and exited through the shallow ditch Everett had dug the previous summer. No flooding, no foundation shift, no structural damage. The underground wood shelter had survived its first winter, and it had done more than survive. It had proven that sometimes the crazy idea is just an idea nobody else had the courage to try. Spring 1882 brought the questions. Men started showing up at Everett's door, asking to see the underground chamber. Not to criticize this time, to learn. Jacob Pruitt was first. He walked over one April morning, hat in hand, and said, "I'd like to see how you built that tunnel entrance. The one that doesn't let snow in." Everett showed him, explained the slope, the low door, the way he'd angled the opening to face southeast so drifting snow would pass over it rather than pile against it. By June, Pruitt was digging his own chamber. Smaller than Everett's, 6 by 10 feet, but built on the same principles. Gravel floor, ventilation ports, downhill drainage, a trapdoor into his kitchen, and an external loading entrance. Daniel Calhoun held out longer. Pride, maybe, or just stubbornness. But by the fall of 1882, he was asking Everett for advice on foundation offsets and moisture barriers. Within 3 years, 17 homesteads within 50 miles of the Popo Agie had incorporated some version of Everett's design. Not all of them were identical. Some men built simpler versions, just external root cellars with good drainage and ventilation positioned close to the house. Others went all in, excavating full underground chambers with interior access. A few combined the concept with root vegetable storage, creating dual-purpose cellars that kept both firewood and food dry through the winter. But the principle spread because it worked, and it kept working. By the 1890s, the Ashford method, though nobody called it that officially, had become standard practice for homesteaders in high-elevation, freeze-thaw regions across Wyoming, Montana, and Colorado. You can still find remnants of these underground wood shelters today if you know where to look. Collapsed stone walls, overgrown tunnel entrances, gravel beds that refuse to grow anything because the drainage is still that good, even after 140 years. The technique didn't just save wood. It saved lives. Families that kept their firewood dry had fewer respiratory illnesses from smoke inhalation. They burned fewer green logs, which meant less creosote, which meant fewer chimney fires. Their homes stayed warmer, which meant fewer cases of frostbite and hypothermia during brutal cold snaps. Children slept better. Wives didn't spend half the winter coughing. Men didn't exhaust themselves every morning prying apart frozen wood piles. And here's the deeper lesson, the one that applies whether you're living in 1882 or 2024. The best survival solutions aren't always the loudest or the most popular. Everett Ashford didn't invent underground storage. People have been using root cellars for centuries. But he applied an old principle to a new problem, and he had the guts to do it even when the so-called experts told him he was wrong. He didn't argue with them. He didn't waste energy defending his idea. He just built it, tested it, and let the results speak. That's the frontier way. And that's the lesson we've forgotten in a world where everyone has an opinion, but fewer people are willing to put their hands in the dirt and prove it. Before I wrap this up, if this story taught you something, if it made you think differently about how our ancestors solved problems with nothing but stone, timber, and common sense, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button. Every week, I bring you real techniques from the American frontier, techniques that worked when there was no backup plan, No hardware store, no rescue coming. And drop a comment. What part of this system would you use today if you were building off-grid? The underground access? The gravity drainage? The stable temperature zone? I read every single comment, and I want to hear from you. Now, one last thing. Educational note. This video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. Characters, names, and specific events are fictional, while the techniques, concepts, and principles discussed are based on real historical practices and well-established physical or practical knowledge. Any modern application should be evaluated according to current standards, safety guidelines, and applicable laws or regulations. This content is educational in nature and does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.